I often see patients who are supplemented with an appropriate form of folic acid and or B12. So either the active form or the inactivated form. Yet their blood work continues to show a high mean corpuscular volume, mid-90s to 100. What else can I check, or what can I do to remedy the elevated MCV?
Well, thanks for introducing the question. And if you talk about folate and B12 supplementation, the first thing, possibly the dose is too low. We'll talk a little bit about dose a little later. But then I'd have to ask, is the patient tasting the nutrients, stimulating the gustatory receptors that synapse in the brainstem in the nucleus of the tractus solitarius, and impact the hypothalamus is vitally important. You know, our mouth is up here close to our brain instead of down here close to our stomach for a reason, and we emphasize this over and over in all the seminars that we've taught for many years. But the patients oftentimes are taking nutrients that are appropriate, but they're not getting as much out of them as they should because the brain doesn't realize they're getting them because the patient's just swallowing the pill. Nutrients, in almost all cases, are really foods and should be treated as foods and tasted, chewed if possible, and swallowed as a food would be. Now, if it doesn't taste good, patients should still chew it. If they're going to retch on it, then they, or vomit or something, then maybe they should just suck it if they can't stand to chew it. But they need to taste that nutrient. And so many times I see patients who are taking nutrients and they still test for the nutrients. If they would just taste those nutrients, then they would get not just the biochemical response, but they get the neurological response from the taste buds, which will set up a resetting, so to speak, of the short circuits in the nervous system that are related to that nutritional imbalance, and also create muscle balance and changes in indicators as well. So I show patients that takes the nutrients and it will change their indicators, change their pain, change their balance mechanism or whatever it might be. And I emphasize that to patients, but I actually have them taste the nutrients in the office to show them, if they do taste them, how it will help their problem by changing their pain or range of motion, whatever it is. And that's a useful tool to get patients to taste things when they don't normally taste that good.
Can I make a comment for just a moment? Well,
please, please.
I was at a chiropractic association convention, and students came to me and said, we're part of the AK club at our chiropractic college, and we have one student that just doesn't understand nutrients, tasting a nutrient, and the process that occurs and why it changes a muscle. And they said, could you talk to him about it? And they brought him over to me, and he had been to a number of AK classes. But nobody had ever told him about stimulating the gustatory receptors, synapsing in the brainstem, stimulating the nucleus of the tractus solitarius, which impacts the hypothalamus, and that there are downgoing reticulospinal pathways from the hypothalamus that influence the anterior horn motor neurons of the muscles that we test. For those of you who are practitioners who interact with students, understanding this process and being able to articulate it may achieve the same response that I heard from this student. Why didn't anyone else tell me that? This is a physiologic, neurologic pathway. Now it makes sense to me. Now I understand. Well, this is the reason, one of the reasons, that we try to teach this course in the context of basic science, so that you can talk to anyone on any level about these processes and not only communicate with them about it, but as you are able to communicate them, you're able to apply these principles even more effectively with your patients. So remember that. Gustatory receptors, taste receptors, into the brainstem, nucleus of the tractus solitarius, among other things, stimulating the hypothalamus, downgoing pathways, reticulospinal pathways, that's descending hypothalamic reticulospinal pathways, passing through the anterior horn motor neurons of the muscles that we test and that stabilize our joints and cause us to function appropriately.
Good. So the folate and B12, got to chew it, but it's got to be absorbed as well. When we have absorption issues, we have to check. Are there bad fats, or possibly is the patient taking NSAIDs in their diet that are interfering with absorption? We'd find this in QA step 5. Or are there food allergies we'd find in QA step 6 in the diet interfering with absorption? So this absorption issue can be because of other things the patient's taking that are inappropriate for their needs. Other absorption issues. A high fiber diet in a patient with irritated GI tract may keep the intestinal wall irritated and decrease absorption. Well, we know this from the open ileocecal valve, especially where the patient has to sometimes, when their GI tract is so irritated by the fiber and the sometimes spicy foods, but especially the even good foods, the fiber in the diet, that once the GI tract gets irritated, it stays irritated, and sometimes things won't be absorbed as appropriately as they should be, including B12 and folic acid, until that inflammation reduces in the gut. So we may need to lower fiber temporarily or cook high fiber foods as a typical ileocecal valve concept, but this is also true sometimes for patients who need folic acid and B12, especially folic acid, which is necessary for the gut to heal itself. And as you know, the GI tract epithelium, the columnar epithelial cells, or the lining cells of the GI tract, turn over once every 24 to 48 hours. So these are some of the fastest healing cells in the body. And for cells to reproduce, they need folic acid, as we talked about in previous webinars. So if the gut is irritated, sometimes the body can't absorb the folic acid from the food that's got all the folic acid in it, which is like foliage and green leafy vegetables, because that fiber in those foods sometimes is enough to irritate the GI tract, and it's like becomes a vicious cycle. It can't absorb the folate, it needs to heal. So sometimes we have to cook either lower fiber or cook the high fiber foods to get it absorbed. Another issue is possibly B12 isn't being properly absorbed. And let's look at the following slide from the session 3 of the QA course. This is a summary of a paper written by my friend Datis Karazian in a paper he wrote at the ICAK meeting in 2002. And I quote this slide because he did such a wonderful job of identifying all the factors of B12 absorption. Dietary B12 is freed from its polypeptide linkages by hydrochloric acid and intestinal enzymes. Then it attaches to a salivary R binder polypeptides. So now we've got HCl in the stomach and intestinal enzymes, and now we brought the saliva glands into the play. Then the R binder is destroyed by pancreatic trypsin. Now the pancreas is playing a role. Now this combines, B12 combines with intrinsic factor in the small intestine. That comes from the stomach parietal cells, and this B12 intrinsic factor complex goes to the ileum, where it's actively transported into an enterocyte, which requires calcium and a pH of less than 6. Across the enterocyte via transcobalamin 2 into the portal blood and attaches to serum B12 binding protein. So as we talk about in the QA course, we have all these different organs, stomach, even saliva gland, stomach, pancreas, small intestine, all necessary, adequate calcium and adequate pH to get B12 absorbed. So you see a lot of issues can interfere with B12 absorption, as we so well go over in session 3 of the QA course. So in inflammatory states, let's talk about this B12 thing again. In inflammatory states, the cobalt in the B12 is oxidized from CO2 plus to CO3 plus. In the oxidized cobalt 3 plus state, the cobalt is ineffective and the body can't use the B12. So you got an inflammatory state, the B12 you're taking, maybe even tons of it, it's all staying in its, if it gets oxidized, it stays in this oxidized form and it can't be used properly. So the inflammatory process can interfere with the B12 that we have, even if we have plenty and tons of it. In these patients, we must check for overoxidation, which we check for the bleach sniff test in QA step 7, and a need for other antioxidants in QA 8A and B, such as vitamin E and vitamin C and so on.